I stood in the county courthouse, clutching a manila envelope that contained the deed to my childhood home, the same home my parents had forced me to pay life lessons rent for since I was 16, while my brother lived expense-free well into his 30s. As the auctioneer prepared to sell off my parents' house for their mounting debts, I stepped forward with a document that changed everything. They never knew that while they were teaching me financial responsibility, I was quietly purchasing their mortgage from the bank they'd been avoiding for months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The memory still feels fresh, even 12 years later. My 16th birthday breakfast, plain toast, scrambled eggs, and a manila envelope placed beside my plate. No card. No candle-topped pancakes like the ones my younger brother Dylan always got. Just that envelope with my name written in Dad's blocky handwriting. "Open it," Mom said, sipping her coffee, her gaze never quite meeting mine. Inside was a typed letter as formal as a business contract. "Dear Rachel, now that you have reached the age of 16, it is time you understand the real costs of living in this world. Beginning today, you will contribute $350 monthly toward household expenses. This will teach you valuable lessons about responsibility and prepare you for adulthood. Payments due on the 1st. No exceptions. Late payments incur a $25 fee. Welcome to the real world. Love, Mom and Dad." My throat tightened as I read each line. Across the table, my 13-year-old brother smirked behind his comic book. Even at that age, I recognized the unfairness, but I didn't have the vocabulary to challenge it. "But I only make $8.25 an hour at the grocery store," I said, my voice small. "That's almost all my paycheck." Dad folded his newspaper with a crisp snap. "Then you better pick up more hours or find a second job. The world doesn't hand out free rides, Rachel." Except apparently it did, if you were Dylan. That evening, I called my best friend May from the payphone 2 blocks from our suburban Minneapolis home. Cell phones were for kids who had proven their responsibility. Another thing Dylan somehow qualified for at 12, while I, with my straight A record and perfect attendance, did not. "They can't be serious," May said after I explained the situation. "That's like child labor or something?" "They're completely serious," I replied, watching my breath form clouds in the October chill. "And Dad already told Mr. Peterson at the grocery that I'm available for more shifts. What about your AP classes and debate team? You're trying to get a scholarship." I leaned against the graffiti-etched phone booth. "I guess I'll figure it out. I always do." And I did figure it out, though the cost was steep. I worked 28 hours weekly while maintaining my 4.0 GPA. Sleep became a luxury. My senior year became a blur of morning shifts, afternoon classes, evening debate practices, and late-night study sessions. When acceptance letters arrived from colleges, my parents' only question was how I planned to pay for it. Meanwhile, Dylan's hockey equipment, gaming consoles, and weekend trips with friends were simply provided. His room filled with new possessions while I saved every penny beyond my rent for my future. When I asked about this disparity, the answers were always variations of the same theme. Your brother has different needs. Boys develop responsibility differently than girls. You're naturally more mature, Rachel. He'll learn these lessons when he's ready. The summer before college, I worked 3 jobs: morning barista shifts, afternoon receptionist at a dentist's office, and weekend inventory at a warehouse. By August, I had saved enough for my first semester's tuition and books at the state university, plus a security deposit on a shared apartment. The night before I left, Mom knocked on my bedroom door. I was surrounded by carefully labeled boxes. Everything I owned fit into 5 containers and 2 suitcases. "We got you something," she said, handing me a small box wrapped in plain blue paper. Inside was a calculator, the expensive graphing kind I'd needed for AP Calculus but couldn't afford. I'd borrowed May's all year. For college, Mom said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. We're proud of how responsible you've become. I thanked her, swallowing the bitter thought that the calculator cost less than 2 months of the rent I'd paid them. The next day, they drove me to campus in silence. As Dad unloaded my boxes at the dormitory curb, he handed me an envelope. Another letter, this one explaining that my rent obligations were suspended during college, provided I maintained a 3.5 GPA and didn't ask for additional financial support. Thank you, I said mechanically, wondering what would have happened if I'd refused to pay all those years. Would they have kicked out their 16-year-old daughter, reported me to some authority, or simply admitted it was a test I was never meant to pass? College became my sanctuary. I worked part-time at the university library and took out minimal loans. I chose economics as my major, fascinated by the flows of capital and the psychology behind financial decisions. Why did some people seem trapped in cycles of scarcity while others accumulated resources easily? What invisible rules governed these patterns? And most importantly, how could understanding these systems help me break free from the constraints I'd grown up with? Professor Abernathy's behavioral economics class became my intellectual home. White-haired with piercing green eyes, she challenged every assumption about rational markets and financial decision-making. People aren't calculators, she'd say, pacing before the whiteboard filled with equations. They're storytellers. The stories we believe about money shape our financial reality, more profoundly than interest rates ever will. I stayed after class one afternoon, hesitantly sharing my family's rent arrangement. I expected judgment, either of my parents or of my compliance. Instead, she listened thoughtfully. Your situation is actually a fascinating case study in asymmetric family economics, she said. Have you considered that your parents may be operating from a scarcity mindset themselves? This perspective had never occurred to me. I'd always seen their actions as deliberately unfair, not potentially rooted in their own financial fears. Track your family's patterns, she suggested. Not just what they say about money, but what they do. Sometimes the most significant financial education comes from recognizing the invisible scripts we've inherited. That conversation shifted something fundamental in my understanding. I began observing my family's financial behaviors during holiday visits with the detached curiosity of a researcher rather than the raw hurt of a daughter. I noticed how Dad fretted over electric bills but leased a new truck every 3 years, how Mom clipped coupons obsessively while maintaining an unused home gym with equipment still wrapped in plastic, how they boasted about Dylan's sales job but never mentioned that he lived in their finished basement, rent-free at 23, with groceries provided and utilities covered. It wasn't just favoritism, it was financial inconsistency masquerading as parental wisdom. During my junior year, I landed an internship at Northern Trust Financial. My supervisor, Vivian Rhodes, took a special interest in my work on client psychology profiles. Over lunch one day, she asked about my background. I'm impressed with your understanding of emotional financial triggers, she said. That usually comes from experience, not textbooks. The whole story tumbled out. The rent envelopes, the different standards for my brother, the years of working while watching Dylan receive effortless support. Vivian's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened. I started paying for my school lunches at 9, she said after a moment. My father believed girls needed to learn self-sufficiency earlier. My brothers never had to work a day before college. She set down her fork with precision. What I learned wasn't what my father intended. I learned that financial structures often mask emotional agendas. That lesson made me very good at my job. She studied me for a moment. You've learned similar lessons, I think. The question is, what will you build with that knowledge? That question followed me through graduation, through landing my first full-time position at Meridian Investment Group, through moving into my own apartment in downtown Minneapolis. What would I build from the uneven foundation I'd been given? I established methodical habits. 30% of every paycheck went to savings, 15% to investments. I researched every purchase, tracked every expense, and built an emergency fund that grew month by month. By 25, I had more financial stability than many colleagues a decade older. Meanwhile, my parents' financial situation deteriorated in ways they tried to hide. Mom took a part-time retail job she claimed was just for socializing. Dad's contracting business faced increasing competition from younger companies with better technology and lower prices. Their Christmas cards mentioned exciting business opportunities that changed suspiciously often. Dylan still lived at home, now working sporadically as a freelance graphic designer. His Instagram showed new camera equipment and weekend trips, while our parents' house developed obvious signs of deferred maintenance, sagging gutters, peeling paint, a patched roof. During a rare visit home, I noticed past due notices hidden beneath magazines on the kitchen counter. When I asked about them, Dad bristled. "We're fine, Rachel. Not everyone needs to track every penny like it's a religion." His defensiveness told me everything I needed to know. They weren't fine, but pride prevented them from acknowledging it. The following week, I took Professor Abernathy, now a mentor and friend, to lunch and outlined my concerns. "I think they're in serious financial trouble," I said, "but they won't talk about it, especially with me." She considered this while stirring her tea. "Why especially with you?" "Because I've become everything they claimed to want me to be. Financially responsible, independent, careful with money. Admitting their problems would mean facing that their methods worked for me, but failed for themselves and Dylan." She nodded slowly. "So the question becomes, what responsibility, if any, do you have toward family members who treated you unequally?" I had no answer, only the complicated tangle of resentment, concern, and lingering desire for approval that characterized my relationship with my parents. A month later, Vivian called me into her office. In the 3 years since my internship, I'd risen to become one of Meridian's top financial advisors, with a growing reputation for helping clients navigate emotionally complex wealth transitions. "I have an unusual situation," she said, closing her office door. "A local bank, Lakeside Credit Union, is quietly selling off some underperforming mortgages at steep discounts. Most are hopeless cases, but a few might be salvageable with the right approach." She slid a folder across her desk. "This particular property caught my attention because it's in your old neighborhood. The owners have been in pre-foreclosure 3 times in the past 2 years, making minimum payments just before deadlines. But they're underwater now with no realistic recovery path. The auction is scheduled for next month." I opened the folder. The address leaped from the page, my parents' house. "They don't know I'm telling you this," Vivian said quietly. "Client confidentiality prevents Lakeside from reaching out to family members. But there's nothing preventing you from purchasing this mortgage if you wish, though I'd understand completely if you chose not to get involved." My mind raced with calculations and consequences. I had the resources to buy the discounted mortgage. My emergency fund plus investments would cover it. But should I? What would this decision mean for my relationship with my parents? For my own sense of justice and closure? "You don't need to decide now," Vivian said, "but the window for action is narrow. The auction is scheduled for the 15th. That evening, I sat on my apartment balcony overlooking the Minneapolis skyline, the mortgage folder open beside me. Rain tapped against the railing as I sorted through every angle, every potential outcome. Helping my parents would mean using my carefully saved resources to rescue the very people who had demanded I pay for the privilege of being their child. It meant potentially enabling the continuation of patterns that had damaged our family relationships. It meant sacrificing my hard-won financial security. Not helping meant watching my childhood home sold to strangers. It meant knowing I could have prevented my parents' displacement but chose not to. It meant wondering forever if I'd acted from justice or vengeance. As midnight approached, I made my decision. I would purchase the mortgage, not to rescue my parents unconditionally, but to create leverage for an overdue reckoning. This wasn't about revenge or absolution. It was about finally addressing the imbalanced scales that had defined our family for too long. The next morning, I called Vivian and set the process in motion. Through a limited liability company with a name that wouldn't trigger recognition, I purchased my parents' mortgage for 60 cents on the dollar. The paperwork was processed through Meridian's legal department, with every step carefully documented and every ethical guideline followed. As the auction date approached, I requested a week's vacation, the first extended break I'd taken in 3 years. I packed a single suitcase, rented a car, and drove the familiar route back to my hometown, preparing for a confrontation 12 years in the making. The county courthouse stood solid and imposing, its limestone facade darkened by decades of Minnesota winters. I arrived an hour early, dressed in a charcoal suit that projected the professional confidence I'd worked so hard to build. In my briefcase were the documents proving my ownership of my parents' mortgage, the legal right to decide their housing future. At 10:30 a.m., I spotted them entering the courthouse, Dad looking smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched, beneath a sport coat that had grown too large for his frame, Mom clutching her purse like a shield, her hair more gray than brown now, and Dylan trailing behind them, his expression bewildered as if he couldn't quite grasp the gravity of the situation. They didn't see me standing in the shadowed corner of the hallway. They didn't know that I held their financial fate in my hands. They didn't realize that today, the unbalanced lessons of our past would finally reach their logical conclusion. As the auctioneer called the room to order and began outlining the proceedings, I stepped forward, manila envelope in hand, ready to reveal the truth that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The auctioneer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. Next on the docket, property at 1547 Lakeview Drive, current owners Robert and Susan Whitman. Opening bid starts at $175,000 to cover outstanding mortgage debt and fees. My parents stiffened in their seats. The amount was far below the actual value of the house, even in its neglected state, but still more than they could possibly produce. Mom's knuckles whitened around her purse strap. Dad stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, his pride visibly crumbling. Dylan looked confused, scrolling through his phone as if the answer to their financial salvation might be found in his social media feeds. He'd been sheltered from reality for so long that even now, he couldn't grasp the gravity of what was happening. "Do I have an opening bid?" the auctioneer asked, scanning the modest crowd of property investors and bargain hunters. A balding man in the second row raised his hand. 175. Another voice from the back. 180. My father's shoulders sagged further with each increasing bid. My mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears. This was the moment I had carefully orchestrated, yet seeing their distress brought me no pleasure. Only a complicated mix of vindication and sorrow. I took a deep breath and walked to the front of the room, my heels clicking against the polished floor. "Excuse me," I said, addressing the auctioneer. "I believe this auction needs to be postponed." All eyes turned toward me. From their seats, my parents' expressions transformed from despair to shock as they recognized me. "Rachel?" "Mom," whispered, half rising from her chair. I placed my documents on the auctioneer's table. "I represent Keystone Holdings LLC, which has recently purchased the debt obligation for this property from Lakeside Credit Union. We'll need time to review the situation before proceeding with any auction." The auctioneer examined my paperwork. With practiced efficiency, then nodded. "Everything appears to be in order. This auction is temporarily suspended pending further notice." Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd as disappointed bidders began collecting their things. My father stood frozen, his face pale with incomprehension. Dylan finally looked up from his phone, sensing that something significant had occurred. I turned to face my family. "We should talk," I said quietly. "Perhaps at home?" The drive back to Lakeview Drive passed in strained silence. I followed my parents' sedan in my rental car, watching as Dad took each turn with mechanical precision. In the rearview mirror of their car, I could see Mom repeatedly turning to look at me through the back window, her expression unreadable. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The blue paint faded, the once pristine lawn now patchy and overgrown. The basketball hoop where Dylan had spent countless hours practicing still hung precariously from the garage, net long gone. My father's prized rose bushes, once meticulously tended, had grown wild along the front walkway. We gathered in the living room, where the familiar floral-patterned sofa had been replaced by a leather sectional that already showed signs of wear. Family photos lined the mantel, Dylan's hockey tournaments, graduation, and various celebrations. I noticed with a pang that my photos stopped around age 16, as if my documented life in this family had ended when the rent payments began. "What is this about, Rachel?" Dad finally asked, his voice rougher than I remembered. "What kind of game are you playing?" "It's not a game," I replied, setting my briefcase on the coffee table. "Keystone Holdings is my company. I purchased your mortgage from Lakeside Credit Union last month when I learned it was being sold off." Mom sank onto the edge of the sectional. "You bought our mortgage? How is that even possible?" "I work in finance," I said. "I manage millions in assets for my clients every day. Purchasing a discounted mortgage is fairly straightforward, when you know the system." "But why?" Dad demanded, remaining standing. "To humiliate us? Is that it?" The accusation stung, especially coming from the man who had demanded rent from his teenage daughter while giving his son a free ride. "No," I said evenly. "Not to humiliate you. To have this conversation, the one we should have had years ago about fairness, responsibility, and family." Dylan flopped onto the sectional, still clutching his phone. "What's the big deal? So Rachel bought some paperwork. Does this mean we keep the house or what?" I turned to my brother, seeing him clearly for the first time in years. At 32, he had the casual entitlement of someone who had never faced real consequences, never had to solve his own problems. It wasn't entirely his fault. Our parents had created this reality for him as surely as they had created mine. "That depends," I said, "on what happens next." I opened my briefcase and withdrew 3 folders, blue, green, and red. I handed the blue one to my mother. "This contains the details of your mortgage, including payment history, current balance, and the terms of my purchase," I explained. "As you'll see, I paid 60 cents on the dollar for the debt, which gives me considerable flexibility in how we proceed." Mom flipped through the pages, her librarian's attention to detail evident in how carefully she examined each number. "I don't understand some of these terms," she admitted finally. "The important parts are on page 3, I said gently. "Your mortgage was underwater. You owed more than the house is currently worth. You've also missed 11 payments in the past 2 years, making minimum catch-up payments just before foreclosure proceedings." Dad's face flushed. "The economy's been tough. My business—" "I'm not here to judge your business decisions," I interrupted. "I'm here to address our family's pattern of unequal expectations and responsibilities." I handed the green folder to my father. "This contains every record I have of the rent I paid from ages 16 to 18, $8,150 in total. It also includes an itemized list of household expenses during that time, market rate rental values for comparable properties, and Minnesota state laws regarding parental financial obligations to minor children." His hands trembled slightly as he took the folder. "Finally," I continued, handing the red folder to Dylan, This contains documentation of the financial support our parents provided to you from age 16 to present, including housing, food, utilities, car payments, insurance, cell phone plans, and miscellaneous expenses. The conservative estimated value is $267,000 over 16 years. Dylan stared at the folder like it might bite him. I don't get it. What does any of this have to do with the house? I took a deep breath. This was the moment everything changed. I'm offering you 3 options, I said. First, I can proceed with the foreclosure and auction, which would require you to vacate the property within 30 days. Second, I can modify the mortgage to a manageable payment schedule, contingent on certain changes I'll outline in a moment. Or third, I can forgive the mortgage entirely and transfer ownership back to you with no further financial obligation. My parents exchanged glances, hope and suspicion warring in their expressions. What's the catch? Dad asked. The catch is honesty, I replied. Before I decide which option to pursue, I need to understand why. Why did you charge your 16-year-old daughter rent while your son has lived here free into his 30s? Why did you call it teaching responsibility when it was applied so unequally? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with decades of unspoken resentment and confusion. Mom looked down at her hands. We thought we were doing the right thing. For whom? I pressed. For you, Dad insisted, color rising in his face again. We wanted you to be strong, independent, not to struggle like we did. And Dylan didn't need those same lessons? My brother shifted uncomfortably. Hey, don't drag me into this. It's not my fault they had different rules. It's exactly the point, I said, turning to him. Different rules created different outcomes. I became financially independent because I had no choice. You remained dependent because you were never expected to be anything else. We knew you could handle it, Mom said softly. You were always so capable, so mature. Dylan was different. Different how? I asked. The silence stretched until Dylan himself broke it. They thought I was fragile, he said, surprising me with his insight. Like I'd break if they pushed too hard. Dad sank into an armchair, suddenly looking every one of his 67 years. Your brother struggled in school, the doctors suggested. They said too much pressure could trigger his anxiety. We were trying to protect him. By charging me rent instead? The pieces were finally coming together, but the picture they formed still felt warped. We needed the money, Mom admitted, tears spilling onto her cheeks. Your father's business was failing. We had medical bills from Dylan's therapy that insurance wouldn't cover. We couldn't lose the house then, not with Dylan still in high school. We made a terrible choice. We used your strength against you because we were desperately trying to hold everything else together. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. All these years, I'd believed I was paying rent as some misguided lesson in responsibility. The truth was both simpler and more complex. My parents had used me as a financial crutch because I was the only one they believed could bear the weight. Why didn't you just tell me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why the pretense? About life lessons and the real world? Dad passed a hand over his face. Pride, shame, fear that you'd resent us, fear that you'd refuse. Take your pick. So instead, you made me believe I was being singled out because I needed to learn. Lessons Dylan didn't. We never meant to hurt you, Mom said. We thought someday, when you were successful, which we always knew you would be, we'd explain everything. Maybe even pay you back. But you never did explain. And here we are, 12 years later, with the same pattern still in place. I gestured toward Dylan. He still lives here rent-free. You're still protecting him from consequences while barely staying afloat yourselves. Dylan stood abruptly. This isn't fair. You're making me sound like some kind of parasite. You're not a parasite, I said. You're the product of their choices, just as I am. The difference is that their choices forced me to become independent while allowing you to remain dependent. I turned back to my parents. This brings us to my conditions for option 2, mortgage modification. I withdrew a contract from my briefcase and placed it on the coffee table. If you want to keep this house with a manageable payment plan, these are my terms. First, Dylan pays market rate rent to you, starting immediately. Second, he assumes responsibility for his own expenses, phone, car, insurance, everything. Third, you both meet with a financial counselor of my choosing monthly for at least 1 year. Dad bristled. You have no right to dictate how we live our lives. Actually, as the holder of your mortgage, I have considerable legal right over this property, I corrected him. But more importantly, as your daughter who subsidized this household as a minor, I believe I've earned the right to ensure history doesn't repeat itself. Mom reached for the contract with shaking hands. And option 3? You mentioned forgiveness? I nodded. Option 3 is simple but more difficult in its own way. I forgive the mortgage entirely if you can look me in the eyes and tell me truthfully that you believe the way you treated me was fair. That charging rent to your teenage daughter while letting your adult son live free was justifiable, even knowing what it cost me in lost opportunities, sleep, academic experiences, and simple childhood security. The challenge hung in the air, between us. Dad looked away first. We can't say that, Mom whispered. Because it wasn't fair. We knew it wasn't fair even then. For the first time in our confrontation, Dylan seemed to truly understand what had happened. They made you pay? Rent when you were my age? He asked, the concept finally sinking in. While I was. Jesus, Rachel. I had no idea. I know you didn't, I said. That's part of the problem. Our family has operated on unspoken rules and hidden truths for so long that none of us really sees the others clearly. I gathered my documents and returned them to my briefcase. I'll give you time to discuss your options. You have until the end of the week to decide which path you want to take. As I stood to leave, Dad rose too. Wait, he said, his voice thick with emotion. What would you do? If you were us? The question surprised me. In all my planning, I hadn't expected him to seek my advice. I'd choose option 2, I said after a moment. Not because it's easiest, but because it creates the opportunity for real change. For all of you to develop healthier patterns together. Mom nodded slowly. And what about you? Would you be part of that change? The question pierced straight to the heart of what I had been avoiding. In focusing on their financial situation, I had sidestepped the deeper question of our relationship, whether anything remained worth salvaging after years of inequity and unacknowledged harm. I don't know, I answered honestly. That depends on what happens next. On whether acknowledgement leads to actual change, or just becomes another family secret we all pretend not to see. Dylan stepped forward, his usual swagger replaced by something more tentative. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I didn't know, but I should have. I saw how hard you worked. I just never questioned why. His apology was unexpected. The first, genuine moment between us in years. It wasn't enough to heal the past, but it created a tiny opening toward a different future. I'll be at the Parkview Hotel until Friday, I said, heading toward the door. Take the time you need to decide. As I reached for the doorknob, Mom called after me. Rachel? Thank you. Not for buying the mortgage, though that too, but for giving us a chance to make this right. We don't deserve it, but thank you. I paused, my back still to them. Everyone deserves the chance to grow beyond their mistakes, even parents. The Minnesota afternoon greeted me with unexpected warmth as I stepped onto the porch. The familiar neighborhood stretched before me, the Henderson's oak tree, now towering where it had once been a sapling. Mrs. Abernathy's garden still meticulously maintained, the corner where I had waited for the school bus in all weather, calculating how many hours I would need to work that weekend to make my rent payment. I had returned to this place expecting to feel triumph in finally confronting the inequality that had shaped my adolescence. Instead, I felt something more complex, a melancholy understanding of how fear and desperation can warp even loving parents' decisions. Not excusing it, but seeing it more clearly for what it was. As I drove away from the house that had never quite felt like home, I realized that the true power in this situation wasn't holding my family's mortgage or deciding their financial fate. The true power was in finally speaking my truth after years of silent acceptance, and in choosing how this story would end, not from a place of retribution, but from a place of growth. The Parkview Hotel offered a stark contrast to my childhood home. Clean, impersonal, with no emotional landmines hidden in its generic decor. I ordered room service and spread my work across the king-sized bed, attempting to focus on client portfolios rather than the family drama unfolding across town. My phone buzzed with a text from Vivian. "How did it go?" I stared at the screen, unsure how to distill the afternoon's revelations into a simple message. Finally, I replied, "Complicated. They used my rent money to pay for my brother's therapy. And keep the house. Never told me." Her response came quickly. "The truth is always more nuanced than we expect. What will you do now?" "Give them time to decide. Then see if anything can be rebuilt." "Wise," she texted back. "Remember, healing family finances often requires healing family narratives first." I set my phone aside and walked to the window, watching the sunset paint the Minneapolis skyline in shades of amber and gold. The city where I had built my new life glowed in the distance, while behind me, in the town of my childhood, my family grappled with the consequences of decisions made long ago. 3 days passed with no word from my parents. I kept myself busy with remote work and long walks around Lake Harriet, reacquainting myself with the city that had shaped me. On Thursday evening, just as I was beginning to think they might choose foreclosure rather than face the changes I'd proposed, my phone rang. "Rachel? It's Mom. We've made our decision. Can you come over tomorrow morning?" Her voice gave away nothing, but the fact that they wanted to meet in person suggested they weren't choosing option 1. "I'll be there at 10, I promised. That night, sleep eluded me as I considered all possible outcomes. Had I gone too far in my demands? Not far enough? Was I using financial leverage to force changes that could only genuinely occur through willing transformation? The questions circled endlessly until dawn lightened the hotel curtains. The next morning, I dressed carefully in dark jeans and a cream sweater, deliberately casual, a contrast to the power suit I'd worn to the courthouse. This meeting wasn't about establishing authority. It was about whether reconciliation was possible. When I arrived, I was surprised to find not just my parents waiting, but also a stranger, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. "Rachel, this is Dr. Helen Martinez," Mom said after greeting me. "She's been Dylan's therapist since he was 14. I shook the woman's hand, confusion evident in my expression. "Your parents asked me to join this conversation with Dylan's permission," Dr. Martinez explained. "They felt it might help clarify some aspects of your family's history." We settled in the living room, the same space where we had confronted each other days earlier. Dylan was noticeably absent. "Where's my brother?" I asked. "At a job interview," Dad said, a hint of pride in his voice. "For a graphic design position at Wilson Media. His first real interview in, well, too long." Mom folded her hands in her lap. "We've chosen option 2, she said directly. "The mortgage modification, with your conditions. All of them." Relief washed through me, though I kept my expression neutral. "I'm glad to hear that. But before we sign anything," Dad continued, "we wanted you to understand the full context of our past decisions. Not as an excuse, but as an explanation, with Dr. Martinez's help. The therapist leaned forward. Rachel, your parents have given me permission to share some information about your brother's medical history that they've kept private, even from him, for many years. What followed was the story my parents had never told. Dylan's diagnosis at age 12 with a severe anxiety disorder complicated by undiagnosed learning disabilities. The specialists who warned that traditional expectations might trigger debilitating panic attacks. The mounting medical bills that insurance classified as experimental treatments and refused to cover. We were terrified, Mom admitted, tears streaming down her face. The psychiatrist told us Dylan's condition could deteriorate into self-harm if we pushed him too hard academically or socially. Meanwhile, Dad added, my business was failing. The housing market crashed, contracts dried up, and suddenly we couldn't afford the very treatments our son desperately needed. Dr. Martinez nodded. This was before parity laws required equal coverage for mental health conditions. Many families faced impossible choices. So you chose me, I said softly. You chose to place the financial burden on your daughter rather than risk your son's health. It was wrong, Dad acknowledged, his voice breaking. We convinced ourselves we were teaching you valuable skills, that the rent was preparing you for adulthood. But really, we were drowning and using you as a lifeline. I absorbed this information slowly, recalibrating my understanding of our family history. Why didn't you ever tell me? Even later when I was an adult? Mom wiped her eyes. At first, it was to protect Dylan's privacy. Mental health still carried such stigma. Then, as years passed, the lie grew too big to correct without admitting how terribly we'd failed you. We were cowards, Dad said bluntly. And you paid the price for our cowardice. The room fell silent as the weight of their confession settled around us. Dr. Martinez watched me carefully, offering neither judgment nor absolution for any of us. Finally, I spoke. Thank you for telling me now. It doesn't change what happened, but it helps me understand. I reached into my bag and withdrew the mortgage modification papers I had prepared, already signed. These are ready whenever you are. Mom looked surprised. You brought them already signed? I hoped this was the choice you would make, I admitted. Because it's the one that gives us all a chance to start again. Not from scratch, but from truth. Dad took the papers with trembling hands. The conditions, about Dylan paying rent and managing his own expenses. Will that start immediately? The agreement gives you 30 days to implement those changes, I explained. I understand transitions take time. He's already started, Mom said, a hint of pride in her voice. Yesterday he opened his own bank account and made a budget. He's meeting with a career counselor next week. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. That's impressive. Your brother has been managing his condition successfully for years with the right therapy and medication, Dr. Martinez explained. But your parents continued the protective patterns long after they were medically necessary. Sometimes families need an external catalyst to change entrenched behaviors. Like a mortgage crisis, I said wryly. Like a daughter brave enough to speak her truth, Mom countered softly. We spent the next hour reviewing the mortgage terms, which reduced their monthly payment by nearly 40% and extended the term to make it manageable on their retirement income. As we finished, Dad set down his pen and looked at me directly. This doesn't erase the past, he said. We know that. But we hope it might be the beginning of a different kind of future. For all of us. I hesitated, then spoke the question that had lingered beneath all others. Did you ever regret it? Making me pay when I was so young? Mom reached for my hand across the coffee table. Every single time you handed us that envelope. Every time we saw how tired you were from working. Those extra shifts. Every scholarship dinner we couldn't attend because you were covering someone's shift at the grocery store. We regretted it constantly. But we were too proud and too afraid to admit we'd made a terrible mistake, Dad added, and too dependent on the financial help you provided. Their honesty, however belated, loosened something that had been tightly wound within me for years. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, I said truthfully, but I'm willing to try to understand. That's where healing has to start, I think, with understanding. As I rose to leave, the front door opened and Dylan entered, looking uncharacteristically professional in a button-down shirt and slacks. "I got it," he announced, his face breaking into a genuine smile. "I actually got the job." He stopped, short when he saw me, uncertainty replacing his excitement. "Rachel, you're still here." "Congratulations on the job," I said, meaning it. "That's fantastic news." He shuffled awkwardly, then squared his shoulders. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the different expectations. You were right. It wasn't fair. And I'm sorry I never saw it before." His apology, offered without prompting, caught me off guard. "Thank you," I said simply. "Maybe," he ventured, "when I get my first paycheck, we could get dinner somewhere? Start getting to know each other as adults? My treat, obviously." The offer was so unexpected, so tentatively hopeful, that I found myself nodding before I had fully considered it. "I'd like that." As I walked to my car, Mom followed me out to the driveway. "Will you be leaving right away?" she asked. "Back to Minneapolis?" "My flight's Sunday morning," I replied. "I have a client meeting Monday I can't miss." She hesitated, then asked, "Would you consider coming for dinner tomorrow night? Nothing fancy, just a meal together, as a start." I looked at the house behind her, the place that had been both home and not home, the site of inequality and now possibly repair. Yes, I decided, I'll come. But this time, I'm not bringing my checkbook. Mom's startled laugh turned into something more genuine. "Fair enough. More than fair." As I drove away, I realized that while the 16-year-old girl who had first handed over her hard-earned paycheck could never get those years back, the woman I had become could choose a different path forward, one where past injuries were neither forgotten nor allowed to determine the future. The mortgage in my briefcase represented more than a financial transaction. It was the tangible representation of taking back my power, not to punish, but to create the possibility of healing on more equal terms. In the end, the most valuable asset wasn't the house itself, but the truth that had finally been spoken within its walls. Saturday evening arrived with a gentle summer rain, droplets tapping against my rental car as I pulled into my parents' driveway for dinner. I sat for a moment, gathering my thoughts before heading inside. This wasn't just a meal. It was the first voluntary family gathering I had attended in years. The porch light flickered on, and Mom appeared in the doorway, waving me in from the rain. The house smelled of pot roast, my childhood favorite that she had rarely made after I turned 16, claiming it was too expensive for regular dinners. The significance of her choosing this meal tonight wasn't lost on me. "Perfect." "Timing," she said, taking my raincoat. "Everything's almost ready. The dining room table, usually reserved for holidays and special occasions, had been set with the good china and crystal water glasses. Dad was placing a basket of dinner rolls in the center when I entered. "Rachel," he said, nodding awkwardly. "Glad you could make it." Dylan emerged from the kitchen carrying a serving bowl of mashed potatoes. He'd traded yesterday's interview clothes for jeans and a faded t-shirt, but something about his demeanor remained different, more present, less entitled. "I helped cook," he announced, setting down the bowl with exaggerated care. Turns out potatoes are pretty hard to mess up. The normalcy of the scene, a family dinner, casual conversation, felt both foreign and achingly familiar. We took our seats, and for a moment, nobody spoke, the weight of our history hanging over the table like an invisible guest. Dad cleared his throat. I suppose we should acknowledge that this isn't just any dinner. It's a new beginning, I hope. He raised his water glass. To honesty, however uncomfortable. We clinked glasses, the crystal producing a clear, bright tone that seemed to cut through the tension. As we began passing dishes around the table, Mom asked about my work in Minneapolis. I shared stories about Meridian Investment Group, explaining, in simplified terms, how we helped clients navigate complex financial transitions. It sounds important, she said, helping people understand their options during difficult times. It is, I agreed. Many people feel powerless when facing financial decisions. I try to give them back some control. Dylan looked up from his plate. Like you did with Mom and Dad's mortgage. That was different, I hedged. But the principle is the same, Dad observed. You used your knowledge to create options where we saw none. His insight surprised me. I hadn't considered the parallel between my professional work and my approach to their financial crisis. I suppose you're right, I admitted. Though I don't typically have personal history with my clients. Does that make it easier or harder? Dylan asked. The personal connection? I considered his question seriously. Both. Harder because emotions complicate financial decisions. Easier because I truly care about the outcome. The conversation flowed more naturally after that, cautiously navigating around tender topics, while finding unexpected pockets of connection. Dylan talked about his new job, starting Monday. Dad shared stories from his contracting days that I'd never heard before, including projects that had succeeded brilliantly before his business began to struggle. As Mom served apple crisp for dessert, she hesitantly broached the subject we'd been dancing around. Rachel, there's something else we wanted to discuss with you. About the past. I set down my fork, bracing myself. We've been going through our financial records, she continued, and we calculated the exact amount you paid us in rent during those years, plus reasonable interest. Dad slid a folded check across the table. We can't change what happened, but we can at least return what was never ours to take. I glanced at the check without picking it up. The amount, $12,375, represented my original payments plus 15 years of modest interest. Where did this money come from? I asked, knowing their precarious financial situation. We're selling the boat? Dad said, referring to the small fishing boat he'd bought when Dylan was in high school. Another example of the family's uneven priorities, and Dylan contributed from his savings. I looked at my brother in surprise. He shrugged, embarrassment coloring his face. It seemed right. I benefited from the unfairness too, even if I didn't realize it. The gesture touched me more deeply than I had expected. It wasn't about the money, which represented a small fraction of my current annual income, but about the acknowledgement, the recognition of wrong, the concrete step toward making amends. Still, I hesitated to take the check. I don't need this money. We know, Mom said gently, but we need to give it. Not to erase our debt to you. Nothing could do that. But as a tangible symbol that we understand what we did. I thought about it for a long moment, then finally picked up the check. Thank you. I'll put it to good use. As the evening drew to a close, we found ourselves in the living room, the rain still pattering against the windows. The conversation had evolved into something almost comfortable, not erasing the past, but not being paralyzed by it either. What happens now? Dylan asked, giving voice to the question hovering in all our minds. With the mortgage, with everything? Now we honor our agreement, Dad said firmly. You pay rent, handle your own expenses, and we all meet with the financial counselor Rachel arranges. And Rachel? Mom asked, turning to me. What will you do? I considered her question carefully. I'll honor my part too. I'll maintain the modified mortgage, check in periodically, and I'll try to visit more often. Not every weekend, but more than once every few years. The relief on her face was palpable. We'd like that. As I prepared to leave, Dad walked me to my car, sheltering me with an umbrella against the persistent drizzle. "There's something else I need to say," he told me, his voice low and serious. "Something that's been eating at me for years." I waited, rain drumming on the umbrella above us. "I was jealous of you," he admitted. "Of your clarity, your discipline, the way you set goals and achieved them no matter the obstacles. Even as a teenager, you had more focus than I ever managed in my entire life." His confession caught me off guard. "You were jealous of your own daughter?" He nodded, shame evident in his expression. "It's not something I'm proud of. But watching you succeed where I had failed, managing money well, building something lasting, it was difficult. Instead of learning from you, I resented you. It's no excuse for how we treated you, but it's part of the truth we never spoke. I absorbed this new piece of the puzzle, another layer of complexity in our family's dynamic." "Thank you for telling me," I said finally. "That couldn't have been easy." "Nothing worthwhile ever is," he replied, echoing one of his favorite phrases. From my childhood, one I had often repeated to myself during long shifts after school, trying to believe there was purpose in my struggle. The drive back to the hotel gave me space to process the evening. The dinner had been neither a perfect reconciliation nor a complete failure, but something more realistic, a tentative first step on unfamiliar terrain. We were learning to speak, truths long buried, to acknowledge harms long denied. It was messy and uncomfortable and necessary. Back in my hotel room, I called Vivian to update her on the situation. "They're taking option 2, I told her, and they returned my rent money with interest." "Interesting," she said. "How do you feel about that?" "Conflicted," I admitted. Part of me appreciates the gesture. Another part knows that money can't really address what happened. "True healing rarely comes through financial transactions alone," Vivian agreed. "Though in my experience, concrete actions often speak louder than apologies." "They're selling Dad's boat to help pay me back," I said, "and Dylan contributed from his savings." "Those are meaningful sacrifices," she observed, "not equivalent to what you experienced, but significant nonetheless." After we hung up, I sat at the desk and made a decision. Taking out the hotel stationery, I drafted a letter to accompany the check I would be depositing on Monday, not to return it, but to transform it. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed during the night. I completed my packing, checked out of the hotel, and made one final stop before heading to the airport. The Whitman family home looked different in the morning light, less imposing, more ordinary. Dylan answered the door in pajama pants and a rumpled t-shirt, coffee mug in hand. "Rachel, weren't you flying out?" "My flight's at noon," I explained. I wanted to drop something off before I left. Mom and Dad appeared behind him, drawn by our voices. I handed Dad an envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "Open it." Inside was a letter explaining that I had deposited their check into a newly established education fund in the Whitman family name. The fund would provide scholarships to local high school students facing financial hardships, specifically teens, who worked while maintaining their studies. Each year, the scholarship will help one student who demonstrates resilience in the face of economic challenges, I explained. The initial amount is your repayment, but I've matched it 5 times, over and established an endowment that will grow over time. Mom's eyes filled with tears. "You're helping other young people in your situation." I nodded. "Some good should come from what happened. This transforms our family's story from just a private wound into something that helps others." The Rachel. "Whitman Resilience Scholarship," Dad read from the letter. "It's a worthy legacy." The Whitman Family Resilience Scholarship, I corrected gently. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about what we're choosing to build together from here. The embrace that followed was awkward, but genuine. The first time I had hugged my parents in years. Dylan joined hesitantly, completing the circle. I'll call when I land, I promised as I headed toward my car. And I'll email the financial counselor's information tomorrow. We'll be ready, Dad assured me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the three figures still standing in the doorway. They weren't a perfect family, far from it, but they were trying. We all were, and that effort, however belated, mattered. 6 months passed, bringing Minneapolis into the heart of winter. Meridian Investment Group had promoted me to senior advisor, with my own team and expanded responsibilities. My new corner office overlooked the Mississippi River, its surface frozen into a gleaming white highway beneath the December sky. I was reviewing client portfolios when Vivian knocked on my door, a rare smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You've got visitors," she announced, quite unexpected ones. Before I could ask who, my parents and Dylan appeared behind her. They were bundled in winter coats, cheeks flushed from the cold, looking both nervous and determined. "Surprise," Mom said, attempting lightness despite her obvious uncertainty. "We hope we're not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," I assured them, rising from my desk. "This is an unexpected pleasure." After Vivian excused herself, I offered them the sitting area in my office, 2 sleek leather chairs and a small sofa arranged around a glass coffee table. "What brings you to Minneapolis?" I asked, genuinely curious. They had never visited me in the city before. "Several things," Dad replied, removing his gloves. "First, we wanted to see where you work. You've talked about Meridian in our calls, but seeing it helps us understand your life better. Second," Mom added, "we have news we wanted to share in person." She glanced at Dylan, who straightened his shoulders and produced a business card from his wallet, handing it to me with undisguised pride. "Wilson Media promoted me to Associate Design Director," he announced, after only 6 months. I examined the card, impressed despite myself. "That's significant, Dylan. Congratulations." "It comes with a substantial raise," he continued, "which brings us to the third reason we're here." Dad took over. "The financial counselor you arranged for us, Margaret, has been instrumental in helping us restructure our finances. With Dylan's rent and his contribution toward utilities, plus his new salary increase, we're ahead of our mortgage payments for the first time in years. We wanted to thank you in person," Mom explained. "Not just for the mortgage modification, but for forcing us to confront patterns we'd been trapped in for decades." Their gratitude was genuine, but I sensed there was more. "And?" I prompted. Dad cleared his throat. "And we've been working with Margaret on a proposal for the scholarship fund you established." He handed me a folder containing a detailed plan for expanding the Whitman Family Resilience Scholarship. Dylan had designed promotional materials. Mom, leveraging her librarian connections, had arranged partnerships with local high schools to identify qualifying students. Dad had reached out to his former business contacts for additional contributions. "We'd like to make this a true family endeavor," Mom explained. "Not just your creation that we passively benefit from, but something we all actively build together." The thoughtfulness behind their proposal moved me. This wasn't a hasty gesture, but a considered commitment that had clearly taken months of planning. "This is remarkable," I said, reviewing their materials. "You've put tremendous work into this." "We have monthly meetings at the kitchen table," Dylan explained. "Planning sessions with spreadsheets and everything. Very Rachel-like, actually." He grinned, the teasing gentle rather than mocking. "We've learned a lot from you," Dad added quietly. "More than we ever taught you, I suspect." The dynamic between us had shifted subtly but significantly. They weren't seeking my approval exactly, but rather my partnership, not as the daughter they had once exploited, but as the capable professional whose skills they now respected. "I'd be honored to collaborate on expanding the scholarship," I told them. "Your ideas add dimensions I hadn't considered." Relief spread across their faces. Dad looked around my office, taking in the certificates on the wall, the family photo I kept on my desk, a recent one from Thanksgiving, our first holiday together in years. "You've built something impressive here, Rachel," he observed. "Not just professionally, but personally. The strength to confront us, the wisdom to offer paths forward instead of burning bridges. That's a rare combination." His words, free. From the jealousy he had confessed months earlier, felt like the acknowledgement I had unconsciously sought for years. It wasn't easy, I admitted. There were times I wanted to walk away completely. "Why didn't you?" Dylan asked. "After everything that happened, why bother with us at all?" I considered his question seriously. Because rebuilding was ultimately more powerful than abandoning. Walking away might have protected me from further hurt, but it wouldn't have created anything new. Mom reached for my hand across the coffee table. "We don't deserve the chance you've given us, but we're trying to earn it retroactively." "That's all any of us can do," I said, returning her grip. "Learn from the past without being imprisoned by it." After they left, promising to meet again the following day to discuss the scholarship expansion further, I stood at my office window watching snowflakes begin to fall over the city. The Whitman family was far from healed. Too much history lay between us for instant transformation. But we had broken free from the destructive patterns that had defined us for so long. My phone chimed with a text from Dylan. "Forgot to mention, sold my gaming system to contribute to the scholarship fund. Turns out I don't miss it. Who knew?" His message made me smile. Small changes, accumulated over time, could redirect even the most entrenched trajectories. 2 weeks before Christmas, I received an unexpected call from Margaret Wells, the financial counselor I had arranged for my family. "Rachel, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly," she began. "I wanted to share something about your parents and brother that they might not tell you themselves." "Is everything all right?" I asked, concerned. "More than all right," she assured me. "In my 20 years of financial counseling, I've rarely seen a family embrace change so thoroughly. Your father has started mentoring young contractors, teaching business management skills he learned the hard way. Your mother has organized a financial literacy program at her library for teenagers entering the workforce. And your brother—" "Yes?" I prompted when she paused. "Dylan has asked me to help him establish a small trust for any future children he might have, specifically to fund their education. He was explicit that he wants to break the pattern for the next generation." Her words left me momentarily speechless. These weren't the actions of people making superficial changes to appease me. These were the choices of individuals genuinely committed to transformation. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally. "That means a great deal." After hanging up, I found myself reflecting on the journey from that first day in the courthouse to now. I had approached my family's mortgage crisis seeking justice for past inequities. What I hadn't anticipated was that addressing those specific financial imbalances would catalyze deeper healing across multiple dimensions. The week before Christmas, I finalized my gift for my family, 3 identical envelopes containing documents, for the newly expanded Whitman Family Resilience Foundation. Working with Meridian's legal team, I had established a formal nonprofit entity with my parents, and Dylan listed as founding board members alongside me. The foundation would not only continue the scholarship program, but also provide financial literacy workshops for working teens and their parents, mentorship opportunities with successful professionals who had overcome economic obstacles, and emergency assistance for families facing sudden hardship. I had seeded the foundation with a significant personal contribution, far beyond the original repayment amount, but structured it to require active participation from all family members, rather than just my financial support. On Christmas Eve, sitting in the living room of my childhood home, now familiar territory again after several visits, I presented them with the envelopes. "What's this?" Mom asked, turning the heavy cream envelope in her hands. "Open them together," I suggested. As they read through the documents, understanding dawned gradually on their faces. "A foundation?" Dad asked, his voice thick with emotion. "With all of us as equal partners?" "Equal responsibility, equal authority," I confirmed. "This isn't something I'm creating for you, but something we're building together." Dylan studied the mission statement carefully. "To transform financial wounds into wisdom and create pathways to prosperity for the next generation. That's profound." "It's us," I said simply. "Our story, reshaped into something that serves others." Mom wiped tears from her cheeks. "When you first confronted us about the past, I was terrified we'd lost you forever. I never imagined that facing our mistakes could lead to something this meaningful." "That's the thing about financial patterns," I explained. "They're never just about money. They're about the values and relationships underlying the transactions. Change those, and everything else shifts too." Later that night, as snow fell, gently outside, covering the neighborhood in a blanket of pristine white, I stood at my old bedroom window. The room had been converted to a home office years ago, but standing there still evoked memories of the 16-year-old girl who had counted out bills from her grocery store paycheck, wondering why love in her family came with such different price tags for different children. That girl could never have imagined this outcome, not the pain of confrontation, not the complexity of understanding, and certainly not the gradual reconstruction of relationships based on honesty rather than obligation. The journey from exploitation to empowerment hadn't been linear or simple. There had been setbacks along the way. Uncomfortable conversations during financial counseling sessions, moments when old resentments flared, times when I questioned whether reconciliation was truly possible. But standing there, watching Christmas, lights twinkle across the street, I understood something essential. Reclaiming my power hadn't required destroying my family. Instead, it had created the possibility for something new to emerge from the ashes of what had been broken. The mortgage that had once symbolized my parents' financial desperation and unequal treatment now represented a different kind of ownership, not just of property, but of truth. The rent I had paid as a teenager, unjustly demanded and reluctantly given, had transformed into seed funding for opportunities that would help others facing similar struggles. Most importantly, the silence that had surrounded our family's financial disparities for so long had been replaced by honest communication, sometimes uncomfortable, often healing, always necessary. As I turned from the window, I caught sight of my reflection, not the burdened teenager I had once been, nor the vengeful woman who had initially purchased the mortgage, but someone new, a woman who had found the strength to confront injustice and the wisdom to create pathways toward repair. The house that had once been the site of exploitation had become something else, a laboratory for transformation. The mortgage that had nearly been auctioned away was now a cornerstone for building a legacy that extended far beyond our family's private healing. Tomorrow, we would begin the concrete work of establishing the foundation's first initiatives. There would be challenges ahead, old patterns to vigilantly monitor, new skills to develop together. The reconstruction of our family would remain ongoing, imperfect, real. But tonight, in this moment of quiet reflection, I allowed myself to acknowledge how far we had already come. From the brink of foreclosure to the threshold of possibility. From hidden resentments to spoken truths, from financial inequality to shared purpose. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But the direction had fundamentally changed, and in that change lay the most powerful lesson of all. Even the deepest wounds, when brought into the light with courage and compassion, could become the foundation for building something stronger than what had been broken. 18 months after the courthouse confrontation, I found myself standing before an audience of 300 people at the Minneapolis Convention Center. The banner behind me read, Whitman Family Resilience Foundation, First Annual Scholarship. DALA. Financial resilience isn't just about managing money, I explained into the microphone, my voice steady despite my racing heart. It's about understanding the stories we tell ourselves about wealth, worth, and who deserves opportunity. The crowd, a mix of corporate sponsors, educational partners, and community members, listened attentively. In the front row sat my family. Mom in a navy dress she'd proudly told me she'd purchased on sale, Dad looking distinguished in his only suit, and Dylan in a charcoal blazer, his tablet open as he live-tweeted the event as our foundation's newly appointed communications director. Our first year has exceeded all expectations, I continued. We've awarded scholarships to 15 working students across Minnesota, provided emergency assistance to 23 families facing financial crisis, and launched financial literacy, workshops that have reached over 500 teenagers and their parents. The statistics were impressive, but they couldn't capture the true impact of what we'd built, the individual stories of changed trajectories, of burdens lightened, of futures expanded. Tonight, I'd like to introduce you to our inaugural scholarship. Recipients, I said, gesturing toward the side of the stage where a group of teenagers waited nervously. These young people embody the resilience our foundation celebrates. While maintaining excellent academic records, they've worked to support themselves and their families, often in circumstances that would challenge seasoned adults. One by one, they stepped forward as I announced their names and achievements. Maria Gonzalez, who worked 30 hours weekly at her family's restaurant while maintaining a 4.0 GPA. Jamal Washington, who balanced night shifts at a warehouse with caring for younger siblings and earning college credits through advanced placement courses. Aisha Patel, who built a small web design business from her bedroom to help her widowed mother make mortgage payments. In each of their stories, I glimpsed echoes of my own teenage experience, the exhaustion, the determination, the premature shouldering of adult responsibilities. But unlike my solitary journey, these students had something I never did: community, recognition, and institutional support. As the scholarship recipients returned to their seats amid enthusiastic applause, I introduced our keynote speaker, Vivian Rhodes, now not just my mentor, but a founding board member of our foundation. Before I turn the microphone over, I concluded, I want to acknowledge that none of this would exist without my family's courage to confront difficult truths about our past. The Whitman Family Resilience Foundation was born not from perfection, but from the willingness to transform pain into purpose. I met each of their gazes, Mom, Dad, Dylan, seeing in their expressions a complex mix of pride, remorse, and resolve. We had come so far from that day in the courthouse, yet the journey continued to unfold in ways none of us could have predicted. After Vivian's powerful speech about breaking intergenerational cycles of financial inequity, the event transitioned to a reception. I circulated among donors and partners, discussing expansion plans and potential collaborations, occasionally catching glimpses of my family doing the same. Dad had found common ground with several business owners, discussing mentorship programs for young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. Mom was deep in conversation with the superintendent of Minneapolis Public Schools about bringing our financial literacy curriculum into classrooms. And Dylan, to my continuing amazement, was captivating a group of marketing executives with ideas for reaching Gen Z through targeted digital campaigns. "They've taken to this like naturals," observed Margaret Wells, joining me at the edge of the room. Our financial counselor had become a trusted advisor to the foundation, bringing both professional expertise and personal insight into our work. "It's been surprising," I admitted. "I never expected them to embrace it so completely." "People rise to meaningful challenges," Margaret replied. especially when they're connected to redemption. As the evening wound down, we gathered in a quiet corner to assess the gala's success. Early estimates suggested we'd raised nearly double our target amount. The corporate matching pledges put us over the top, Dylan explained, scrolling through donation records on his tablet. Especially Meridian's 3-to-1 match. Vivian really came through. This means we can expand to St. Paul next year, Mom said, excitement brightening her features. The library director there has already expressed interest in hosting workshops. Dad nodded thoughtfully. And we should consider adding trade school scholarships to our program. College isn't the right path for everyone, but certification programs can provide stable careers with less debt. His suggestion reflected a growing evolution in his thinking. The man who had once rigidly defined success through narrow channels now recognized the value of diverse paths forward. That's an excellent idea, I agreed. Let's discuss it at next week's board meeting. As we prepared to leave, a young woman approached us hesitantly. I recognized her as Lydia Summers, one of our scholarship recipients who was now studying nursing at the University of Minnesota. Ms. Whitman, I wanted to thank all of you personally, she said, her voice soft but determined. The scholarship changed everything for me. I was able to reduce my work hours from 30 to 15 per week, which means I can actually sleep sometimes. She smiled. My grades have improved, and I just got accepted into an accelerated program that will let me finish my degree a year early. Mom reached out to squeeze her hand. We're so proud of you, dear. The thing is, Lydia continued, it wasn't just the money. It was knowing that someone saw how hard I was working, that it mattered to someone besides me. That validation. It's hard to explain how much it helps. Her words struck deep. Validation. The recognition of effort, of sacrifice, of striving. The thing I had craved most as a teenager and received least. We understand completely, I told her. And we're honored to support your journey. After Lydia left, we stood in companionable silence for a moment. She reminds me of you, Dad said quietly. That same determination in her eyes. The difference is, she knows people believe in her, I replied. That makes all the difference in the world. The ride home was filled with comfortable conversation about the evening's success, plans for the foundation's future, and small personal updates. Mom had joined a book club. Dad was volunteering with a veterans housing initiative. Dylan had started seeing a therapist again, this time by choice, to work through lingering anxiety issues that his increased responsibilities had triggered. It's different when I choose it, he'd explained when telling me about the therapy. Before it was something happening to me, something I was broken enough to need. Now it's a tool I'm using because I want to be better. That shift in perspective changes everything. His insight resonated with me. Perspective shifts had defined our family's transformation, from seeing financial education as punishment to viewing it as empowerment, from treating money as a secret source of shame to approaching it as a topic for honest discussion. From using economic disparity to divide us to leveraging combined resources to help others. The following Monday, I returned to my office at Meridian to find Vivian waiting for me, an enigmatic smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The board reviewed your performance over the past 2 years, she began without preamble, including your work with the foundation. I set down my coffee, suddenly alert. And they've decided to create a new position, Director of Community. Financial empowerment. The role would focus on expanding our outreach to underserved populations, developing financial literacy programs, and partnering with nonprofits like your foundation to create sustainable models for economic mobility. My heart quickened. That sounds like a dream position. It is, Vivian agreed. And it's yours if you want it. Same salary as your current role, but with more flexibility and greater alignment with your personal mission. The offer was unexpected, but felt like the missing piece in a puzzle I hadn't realized was incomplete. My client work had always been satisfying, but this new role promised to bridge my professional expertise with my growing passion for financial justice. "I'd be honored," I said. Vivian nodded, clearly pleased. "I thought you might say that. The announcement goes out this afternoon." As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "You know, when you first told me about purchasing your parents' mortgage, I had concerns. I worried you were acting from vengeance rather than justice." "There were moments when the line blurred," I admitted. "That's precisely why I'm so impressed with what you've built," she replied. "You transformed a potential weapon into a foundation for healing. That's rare, Rachel, and exactly the kind of thinking this new position requires." The next few months passed in a whirlwind of transitions. My new role at Meridian allowed me to forge partnerships between the firm and community organizations, creating financial education programs that reached people typically excluded from wealth-building opportunities. The foundation continued to grow, expanding its scholarship program and emergency assistance fund. In April, Dad called with unexpected news. "The library's renovating their community room," he explained. "They've asked for proposals from local contractors, and I'm thinking of submitting a bid." "Dad, that's wonderful," I said, genuinely pleased. "You haven't taken on a project in years." "I haven't had the confidence," he admitted, "but working with the foundation has reminded me that I still have skills to offer. Even if I don't get the contract, putting together the proposal feels like reclaiming something I thought was lost." His words echoed my own journey of reclamation, of self-worth, of family relationships, of hope for something better than what had been. A week later, Dylan texted me a screenshot of an email from the Minnesota Small Business Association, confirming his acceptance into their entrepreneurship incubator program. "Starting a design studio focusing on nonprofits," his message read. "Using what I learned from foundation work. Scared but excited. Thoughts?" I called him immediately. "Tell me more." "I've been freelancing for some of our foundation partners," he explained. "They need quality design work, but can't afford big agencies. I think there's a sustainable business model in providing professional creative services specifically for social impact organizations." I was impressed not just by the concept, but by the thoughtful analysis behind it. "You've really thought this through." "I had a good teacher," he replied, his voice warm. "Or rather, an intimidating sister who forced me to learn about profit, margins, and sustainable growth models." We laughed together, the sound free from the tension that had characterized our interactions for so many years. "The incubator provides shared office space and mentoring," he continued. "But I'll need to find startup capital." "Have you spoken with Margaret about a business plan?" I asked. "We've been working on it for weeks," he confirmed. "She thinks I should approach community development financial institutions rather than traditional banks. Better terms for social enterprise startups." His financial literacy, a concept that would have been utterly foreign to the Dylan of 2 years ago, struck me anew. "I think it's brilliant," I told him truthfully. "You've found a way to combine your creative talents with genuine social impact." "I'm not trying to be you," he said after a moment. "That was my mistake before, resenting you instead of finding my own path. This feels right because it's authentically me, just a more responsible version." In June, Mom retired from the library after 32 years of service. Rather than the quiet departure she'd always envisioned, she was celebrated with a community reception honoring her creation of the library's financial literacy program for teens, a direct offshoot of our foundation's work. "I never expected to leave a legacy," she told me as we prepared for the event. "I thought I'd just quietly shelve books until they gave me a gold watch and sent me home. Instead, you're changing how an entire generation in this community thinks about money," I pointed out. She adjusted her reading glasses, a nervous habit I recognized from childhood. It feels like a second chance to get things right. The reception was well attended, with former students sharing how her program had influenced their financial choices. A 16-year-old girl recounted how Mom's workshop had given her the confidence to open her first checking account and negotiate her initial salary at a summer job. Mrs. Whitman told us that financial confidence isn't about having money, it's about having knowledge, the girl explained. That changed everything for me. Watching Mom accept a plaque commemorating her contributions, I felt a complex surge of emotions. Pride in her accomplishments, gratitude for her transformation, a lingering echo of grief for what my own teenage years might have been had she understood then what she championed now. Dad seemed to sense my thoughts, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "She's trying to make amends in her own way," he said quietly. "We all are." "I know," I assured him, "and it matters." That summer brought another unexpected development. When the foundation received its largest donation to date, a $1 million gift from an anonymous benefactor. The accompanying note simply read, "For those who shoulder adult burdens while still children themselves, may they find the support I never had." Despite extensive research, we couldn't identify the donor. The gift had been carefully structured through multiple financial intermediaries to maintain complete anonymity. "Whoever it is, they've clearly experienced what our scholarship recipients are going through," Margaret observed during an emergency board meeting called to discuss the unprecedented donation. "The question is, how to use it responsibly," Mom said. "This could transform our capacity, but it comes with greater responsibility." After lengthy discussion, we decided to establish an endowment that would ensure the foundation's sustainability beyond any single funding source. We also expanded our geographical reach to include rural communities where working students often faced even greater barriers to education and advancement. In August, exactly 2 years after the courthouse confrontation, I invited my family to dinner at my Minneapolis apartment, a gesture that would have been unimaginable in our earlier dynamics. They arrived bearing housewarming gifts despite my protests that I'd been living there for years. Mom brought a handmade quilt, Dad a set of bookshelves he'd crafted himself, and Dylan a framed digital artwork he'd created showing the skyline of each city where I'd lived. "We're making up for lost time," Mom explained simply. Over dinner, the conversation flowed easily between foundation updates, personal news, and planning for the upcoming holiday season. None of us mentioned the anniversary explicitly, but its significance hovered in the background, not as a source of tension, but as a marker of how far we'd traveled. After dessert, I brought out a bottle of champagne and 4 crystal flutes. "I have news," I announced. "Meridian has approved a major expansion of our community financial empowerment initiatives. We'll be launching programs in 5 additional cities next year, with the foundation as our primary community partner." "That's fantastic," Dad exclaimed. "The corporate partnership gives us credibility with other potential sponsors. And access to resources we couldn't afford otherwise," Dylan added. "Will you be traveling to the new locations?" "That's the other part of my news," I continued. "I've been promoted to National Director of Financial Empowerment Initiatives. It comes with a significant salary increase, more autonomy, and yes, some travel to our regional offices." Congratulations flowed as we toasted the announcement. My family's genuine pleasure in my success felt like a precious gift, one I had once believed would never be mine. "There's something else," I said once the excitement had settled. "Something I've been considering for a while." I withdrew 3 folders from my desk drawer and passed them around the table. "What are these?" Mom asked, opening hers cautiously. "Property listings," I explained, "for investment opportunities in the Minneapolis area." Dad looked up sharply. "Investment properties?" I nodded. "With my promotion and some investments that have performed well, I'm in a position to diversify my portfolio through real estate. I've narrowed it down to these 3 possibilities, but I'd value your input before making a decision." The silence that followed was weighted with understanding. This wasn't just about property investment. It was about inviting them into a financial decision I was fully capable of making alone, choosing to include them not from necessity, but from desire for their perspective. "You're asking for our advice?" Dylan clarified. "On a major financial decision?" "Yes," I confirmed. Dad's contracting experience gives him insight into property condition and improvement potential. Mom's community knowledge helps evaluate neighborhoods. And your design perspective, Dylan, is valuable for assessing modernization possibilities. They exchanged glances, the significance of the moment clear to all of us. "I'd be honored to help," Dad said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Though I'll need to inspect any property in person before giving a final opinion." "Of course," I agreed. "The Riverside location has excellent proximity to public transit and growing neighborhood amenities," Mom observed, already examining the listings with her librarian's attention to detail. "But the Lakewood property has better bones for contemporary redesign," Dylan countered, studying the floor plans. "Those load-bearing walls are more strategically placed. For the next hour, we analyzed the properties together, each contributing unique perspectives to the decision." The conversation was thoughtful, balanced, and utterly unlike any financial discussion we'd had in our family history. Later, as they prepared to leave, Dad lingered behind while Mom and Dylan headed to the car. "I need to say something," he began, his expression serious. "What you did tonight, asking for our input, I recognize what it represents." I waited, giving him space to continue. "You didn't need our advice. You wanted to give us a gift. The chance to be useful, to contribute value, to participate in a decision as equals rather than as people who once exploited you." His insight surprised me. "Yes," I acknowledged. "That's exactly what it was." "It's the most generous thing you could have done," he said softly. "And I want you to know I see it for what it is, not just property advice, but a kind of redemptive invitation." Tears pricked my eyes. "We can't change the past, Dad, but we can choose what we build from here." He embraced me briefly, then stepped back. "We're paying attention now, Rachel, to the lessons you never should have had to teach us." After they left, I stood on my balcony watching their taillights disappear into the city traffic. The evening had marked another milestone in our ongoing reconstruction, not just the foundation's growth or my professional advancement, but the subtle shift in how we engaged with each other around money, power, and value. The family that had once demanded rent from a 16-year-old while exempting her brother from financial responsibility was now engaged in balanced, mutually respectful financial conversations. The father who had been threatened by his daughter's financial acumen now sought her counsel. The mother who had enabled inequality now championed financial literacy for young women. The brother who had benefited from preferential treatment now built his own path with earned confidence rather than entitled expectation. These changes hadn't happened overnight. They were the product of countless difficult conversations, painful acknowledgments, tentative steps forward, and occasional steps back. The transformation hadn't been magical or complete. We still had moments of tension, misunderstanding, and old patterns attempting to reassert themselves. But looking out over the city lights, I understood something fundamental. The truest measure of resilience isn't found in never falling, but in how we choose to rise. My family had been broken by financial fear, inequality, and unacknowledged harm. Yet from those very fractures, we had managed to construct something new, something stronger, more honest, and more purposeful than what had existed before. The mortgage that had nearly been auctioned away had become the catalyst for this metamorphosis, not because of the property itself, but because it had forced us to confront the imbalances that had shaped our family narrative for decades. Standing there in the soft summer evening, I felt a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. Not because everything was perfect, it wasn't. Not because all wounds were fully healed, Some still ached when pressed. But because we had found the courage to transform our private pain into public purpose, our individual healing into collective impact, the Whitman Family Resilience Foundation would continue to grow, touching lives far beyond our immediate circle. My new professional role would expand financial education to communities traditionally excluded from wealth-building knowledge. Dylan's Social Impact Design Studio would help mission-driven organizations amplify their messages. Dad's renewed engagement with his craft would create physical spaces for community connection. Mom's retirement would provide more time for mentoring young women navigating financial independence. All of these expanding ripples had originated from that single moment of confrontation in the county courthouse, a moment when I had chosen to use my power not for revenge, but for the possibility of redemption. As I turned to go inside, my phone chimed with a text from Lydia Summers, our scholarship recipient now thriving in her nursing program. Just wanted to share some news. I've been selected for a prestigious hospital internship. Thank you for believing in me when it mattered most. I smiled, typing back my congratulations. Her message was the perfect reminder of what all our work was ultimately about, creating opportunities for others to write new financial stories, free from the limitations that had once defined their options. The path forward remained uncharted in many ways. There would be new challenges, unexpected obstacles, moments of doubt. But we were no longer walking that path in isolation or inequality. We were moving forward together, building something meaningful, from the broken pieces of our past, not perfect, but purposeful, not without scars, but ultimately stronger at the very places where we had once been torn apart. 5 years after the courthouse confrontation, I stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Renaissance Hotel, looking out at a crowd of over 500 attendees. The 5th annual Whitman Family Resilience Foundation Gala had outgrown the convention center, becoming one of Minneapolis's premier charity events. When we began this journey, I said into the microphone, we had a simple mission: to support working students facing financial challenges similar to those I experienced. As a teenager, what started as a personal response to family inequality has blossomed into something far more profound than we could have imagined. Behind me, a multimedia presentation showcased our foundation's growth. 67 scholarship recipients, now attending colleges nationwide. 12 emergency assistance centers established in communities across Minnesota and Wisconsin. Financial literacy programs implemented in over 200 schools. Mentorship initiatives connecting successful professionals with ambitious teens from disadvantaged backgrounds. Tonight marks a significant milestone, I continued. With your support, we're launching our most ambitious initiative yet, the Resilience Institute. The screen shifted to architectural renderings of a modern building with expansive windows and collaborative spaces. This dedicated campus will house all our programs under one roof: educational workshops, career development resources, emergency, financial services, counseling support, and a research center focused on breaking cycles of economic inequality. But most importantly, it will stand as a physical testament to the possibility of transformation. In the front row, my family watched with expressions of quiet pride. Dad, now 72. His hair completely silver, but his posture still strong. Mom, elegant in a dress she'd splurged on without apology or guilt. Dylan, confident in the tailored suit that reflected his thriving design studio's success. I'd like to invite my family to join me, I said, gesturing toward them. Without their willingness to confront difficult truths and commit to genuine change, none of this would exist. As they made their way to the stage, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the complex emotion that always arose when I considered our journey. Not pure joy, not perfect resolution, but a hard-earned peace that acknowledged both past wounds and present possibilities. The Whitman family story isn't a fairy tale, I told the audience as my parents and brother joined me at the podium. It's a human story, with mistakes, inequality, and pain, but also with courage, growth, and ultimately, purpose. Mom stepped forward to the microphone. 7 years ago, I was part of a system that charged my teenage daughter rent while allowing my adult son to live expense-free. I justified this inequity with phrases like teaching responsibility and preparing for the real world, never acknowledging the double standard or the burden it placed on a child who deserved protection instead of exploitation. Her public acknowledgement, spoken without defensiveness or excuses, still had the power to move me. The woman who had once avoided difficult conversations now faced them directly, with humility and resolve. Dad spoke next, his contractor's hands steady on the podium. When our mortgage went into default and faced auction, Rachel could have walked away. After the way we'd treated her, no one would have blamed her. Instead, she purchased the mortgage herself and created options that allowed us to keep our home while addressing the underlying patterns that had damaged our family. She transformed a financial crisis into an opportunity for healing. Dylan took his turn, his confidence tempered with a self-awareness that had been absent in his younger years. As the brother who benefited from this inequality, I was the last to recognize it. I accepted privileges as entitlements without questioning their source or cost. The Foundation's work reminds me daily that financial patterns reflect deeper values, and that changing those patterns requires more than just different transaction amounts. It requires a fundamental shift in how we recognize human worth. I rejoined them at the center of the stage, a family united not by perfect harmony, but by committed effort to build something meaningful from our complicated history. The Resilience Institute will break ground next month on land that once housed a foreclosed shopping center, I explained. Like our foundation itself, it transforms a symbol of financial failure into a beacon of possibility. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause and a surge in donation pledges. By evening's end, we had secured full funding for the Institute's first phase of construction, a testament to how our story had resonated with others who recognized similar patterns in their own families or communities. Later that night, as the event staff cleared away the last evidence of the gala, my family gathered in a quiet corner of the hotel's garden terrace. The September air carried a hint of autumn's approach, prompting us to huddle closer around the outdoor fireplace. I never imagined we'd be here, Mom said softly, watching the flames dance. Not just at this beautiful event, but here, together, building something that matters. From mortgage default to fully funded institute in 5 years, Dad marveled. It's almost unbelievable. What's truly unbelievable, I pointed out, is how different our conversations about money have become. Remember our first family dinner after the courthouse? How carefully we all chose our words, afraid to trigger old wounds? Dylan nodded. Now we discuss scholarship eligibility criteria and endowment investment strategies over breakfast like it's completely normal. We laughed, the sound carrying into the night sky. Our financial discussions had indeed evolved from tension-filled minefields to productive exchanges of ideas and perspectives. Money talk, once wielded as a weapon in our family, had been transformed into a tool for collective impact. I've been thinking about what comes next, I said after a comfortable silence. For all of us, individually and together. You're not stepping back from the foundation? Mom asked, concern edging her voice. No, not at all. But with the Institute breaking ground and our programs well established, I've been considering how we expand our impact beyond direct services. I outlined the vision that had been taking shape in my mind for months, a policy research initiative that would address systemic barriers preventing economic mobility, working with legislators to reform predatory lending practices targeting vulnerable teens, partnering with employers to create development pathways for working students. The individual support we provide is vital, I explained. But we also need to address the systems that make that support necessary in the first place. Dad leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. You're talking about moving from treating symptoms to addressing causes. Exactly. And that requires a different kind of engagement, one that confronts entrenched interests and challenges conventional wisdom about who deserves economic opportunity and who doesn't. Dylan's eyes lit with understanding. Like how our parents believed I deserved. Support while you deserve challenges. That wasn't just a family decision. It reflected broader societal assumptions about resilience, gender roles, and who should bear financial responsibilities. His insight impressed me. My brother, once oblivious to his own privilege, now recognized its structural dimensions. Precisely, I confirmed. Our family's story was personal, but it wasn't unique. The patterns we're working to change exist at multiple levels: individual, familial, institutional, and systemic. Mom straightened her shoulders, determination settling across her features. Then we expand our work. The Institute provides the platform, but we need to think bigger. The conversation that followed lasted well past midnight, spilling from the terrace to the hotel lobby to Dad's car as he drove me back to my apartment. We debated approaches, evaluated potential partnerships, and brainstormed funding strategies for this expanded vision. By the time I unlocked my front door, we had outlined an ambitious 5-year plan to complement the Institute's direct services with advocacy, research, and policy initiatives designed to address the root causes of economic inequality for working youth. The journey from personal grievance to structural change had been neither simple nor linear. There had been setbacks. Along the way, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves, when the weight of past wounds made forward movement seem impossible. 6 months after our reconciliation began, Dad had reverted to old habits during a foundation budget meeting, dismissing my concerns about overextension as excessive caution in a tone that echoed our earlier dynamics. The moment had frozen, us all, the ghost of our past inequality suddenly present among us. I apologize, he'd said after a tense silence, recognition dawning in his eyes. I'm falling into old patterns. Your caution isn't excessive, it's prudent. Please continue. His self-correction, offered without defensiveness, had marked a significant milestone in our healing. The patterns remained, but our awareness of them had sharpened, allowing us to interrupt harmful dynamics before they regained momentum. Similarly, 3 years into our work together, Dylan had experienced a crisis of confidence when his design studio faced temporary financial struggles. The pressure had triggered anxiety patterns from his youth, leading him to expectation of rescue rather than partnership. I'm not asking you to save me, he'd clarified during a difficult conversation. I'm asking for your perspective as I navigate this challenge myself. The difference matters to me. His ability to distinguish between dependency and collaboration represented growth I wouldn't have thought possible in the brother who had once expected all doors to open without effort. As for Mom, her transformation had perhaps been the most profound. The woman who had once enforced unequal financial expectations between her children now championed equity with fierce determination. When a local business leader questioned our scholarship program's emphasis on supporting working students rather than those with the highest academic achievements, she had responded with quiet authority. Academic excellence nurtured in comfortable circumstances tells only part of the story, she'd explained. We're investing in young people who demonstrate resilience in challenging conditions, those who work not just for personal advancement, but often for family survival. Their type of excellence deserves recognition too. These moments of evolution, large and small, had accumulated over the years, gradually replacing destructive patterns with constructive ones. Not perfectly, not without occasional regression, but with increasing consistency and awareness. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Resilience Institute took place on a crisp October morning. the Minnesota landscape ablaze with autumn colors. Community leaders, corporate sponsors, past scholarship recipients, and foundation partners gathered to witness the symbolic first shovel of dirt that would begin construction. As the featured speaker, I stood before the assembled crowd, looking out over the vacant lot that would soon house our vision. Wind rustled through nearby trees, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and fresh possibilities. "This land has a story," I began. "Once a thriving shopping center, then a foreclosed property, now the future site of an institute dedicated to economic resilience. Its transformation mirrors the journeys of those we serve, and indeed, my own family's path." I gestured toward the golden shovels waiting to break ground. "When we turn these shovels today, we're not just beginning construction on a building. We're continuing the vital work of excavation, digging beneath surface financial transactions, to uncover the values, assumptions, and narratives that shape economic opportunity." In the front row, I spotted familiar faces from various chapters of our story. Vivian Rhodes, my mentor who had first alerted me to my parents' mortgage crisis. Margaret Wells, the financial counselor who had guided our family through difficult conversations. Lydia Summers, our first scholarship recipient, now completing her nursing degree and serving on our youth advisory board. 5 years ago, I stood in a courthouse prepared to reveal that I had purchased my parents' mortgage. An action born from a complex mix of justice-seeking and pain. I couldn't have imagined then that this private family reckoning would evolve into a community-wide commitment to creating more equitable financial futures. I introduced each family member, inviting them to join me near the ceremonial shovels. My father, Robert Whitman, who has taught us that it's never too late to acknowledge mistakes and commit to different choices. Dad stepped forward, nodding to acknowledge the applause. My mother, Susan Whitman, whose work developing financial literacy curricula for young women has reached thousands of teens nationwide. Mom joined him, her eyes bright with emotion. My brother, Dylan Whitman, whose social impact design studio not only created the Institute's visual identity, but has become a leading voice for accessible communication about financial concepts. Dylan completed our line, standing tall beside me. And our extended family, I continued. The 67 scholarship recipients, 12 emergency assistance centers, 200 partner schools, and countless volunteers who give life to our mission every day. Together, we lifted the ceremonial shovels and broke ground on the Resilience Institute. Not just a building, but a physical manifestation of our commitment to transforming financial wounds into wisdom that could benefit others. Later that afternoon, as the crowds dispersed and construction crews began preliminary site work, I found myself alone at the edge of the property. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the ground, highlighting the contours of what would soon rise from this empty space. A familiar voice behind me broke my reverie. "Penny for your thoughts?" I turned to find May, my childhood best friend who had stood by me through those difficult teenage years, now a successful pediatrician and a foundation board member. "Just reflecting on the journey," I told her, "from that first envelope of rent money at 16 to breaking ground on the Institute." She smiled, linking her arm through mine as we had done countless times as teenagers walking home from school. "You've created something extraordinary, Rachel. Not just the foundation or the Institute, but a new narrative about recovery from financial inequality." "We've created it," I corrected her. "All of us together." "True," she acknowledged. "But it started with you refusing to accept that the story had to end with resentment and separation. You chose a different path." Her words reminded me of a conversation with one of our scholarship recipients, a young woman named Zara who had been working 30 hours weekly at a local factory while maintaining honor roll status. When I asked what kept her going during the most challenging times, she had replied simply, "The belief that my current circumstances aren't my final destination, that I'm passing through this difficult place not living in it permanently. That perspective, recognizing hardship as a passage rather than a permanent address, had become central to the Foundation's philosophy. We didn't pretend financial struggles were easy or fair, especially for young people shouldering adult responsibilities. But we insisted that such circumstances need not define one's entire trajectory. "What's next for you personally?" May asked, as we walked the perimeter of what would become the Institute campus. "You've accomplished so much professionally. Is there anything still missing?" Her question prompted me to consider the different dimensions of my life. Professionally, the Foundation's growth had exceeded my most ambitious expectations. My role at Meridian had evolved into a platform for industry-wide advocacy around inclusive financial services. The family relationships I had once believed beyond repair had transformed into partnerships built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Yet something still felt unfinished, not in my external accomplishments, but in my internal journey. "I'm still working on fully separating my self-worth from financial metrics," I admitted. "Those early years of having to earn my place through rent payments left deeper marks than I sometimes acknowledge." May nodded, understanding in her eyes. She had witnessed firsthand how my family's unequal financial expectations had shaped my relationship with money, success, and belonging. "The final piece might be forgiveness," she suggested gently. "Not for them, you've already extended that generously, but for yourself." "Forgiveness for what?" I asked. "I didn't do anything wrong." "For believing, even briefly, that your value was connected to your financial contribution, for internalizing the message that you had to earn your place in your own family, for carrying that burden alone for so many years." Her insight struck a chord within me, identifying a lingering wound I had overlooked while focusing on external reconciliation. Even as I had facilitated healing within my family system, part of me still carried the hypervigilance, the need to prove my worth, the belief that security must be earned through extraordinary effort. "You may have transformed your family's financial patterns," May continued, "but have you fully released yourself from the belief system they initially instilled? The one that said love and belonging are conditional on financial contribution?" I considered her question carefully. "I'm not sure. It's become so embedded in how I operate in the world. The drive, the independence, the financial discipline. Separating the adaptive strengths from the underlying wound isn't simple. Maybe that's the next chapter of your resilience story," she suggested. "Not just external impact, but internal liberation. Freedom from the need to justify your existence through achievement or financial contribution." As the sun began to set over the construction site, casting golden light across what would become the Resilience Institute, I recognized the wisdom in May's observation. The final frontier in my journey wasn't about more external accomplishments, more programs, more recognition, more impact, but about fully reclaiming the internal sense of inherent worth that had been compromised during those formative years. 2 weeks later, I found myself walking through the quiet rooms of my childhood home. Mom and Dad had decided to downsize to a single-level townhouse more suitable for their advancing years, and we were sorting through decades of accumulated possessions. In my old bedroom, long since converted to a home office, I discovered a shoebox tucked high on a closet shelf. Inside were meticulous records of every rent payment I had made from ages 16 to 18, handwritten receipts, dated and signed by my father, each noting contribution toward household expenses in his precise handwriting. Beneath these receipts lay something unexpected, a small leather-bound journal. Opening it revealed my mother's handwriting, entries dated to correspond with my payment schedule. "Rachel paid her rent today," one entry read. "Robert insists." This is teaching her responsibility, but the look in her eyes. I know we're doing something wrong. If we lose her trust, no amount of life lessons will be worth it. But we need the money, and she's so capable. God forgive us for leaning on our child this way. Page after page documented my mother's private, Conflict. Her awareness of the inequality. Her silent disagreement with my father's justifications. Her fear of their financial collapse. Her guilt about relying on my teenage income. The final entry, dated just after I left for college, read simply, "She's gone now, determined and independent, just as we claimed we wanted. But at what cost? What have we sacrificed for short-term financial survival? I pray someday she'll understand. We failed her not because we loved her less, but because we feared losing everything and trusted her strength more than Dylan's. Cold comfort for a daughter who deserved better." The journal revealed a perspective I had never considered. That, behind my parents' united front on the rent issue, had been my mother's private anguish and recognition of wrongdoing. This didn't excuse their actions, but it complicated the narrative I had constructed about their motivations. Taking the journal downstairs, I found Mom sorting through kitchen cabinets, carefully wrapping heirloom teacups in newspaper. "I found this," I said quietly, placing the journal on the counter between us. She froze, recognition flickering across her features. "I wondered what happened to that." "You knew all along that it was wrong," I said, not accusingly but seeking understanding. "Why didn't you say something? Stand up for me?" She abandoned the teacups, wiping her hands on her apron before responding. "Fear," she admitted simply. "Fear of financial ruin. Fear of your father's pride being wounded further as his business failed. Fear of Dylan's fragility if pushed too hard. And perhaps most shamefully, fear of acknowledging that I was complicit in treating my children unequally." Her honesty, brutal and complete, created space for a question I had never directly asked. "Did you ever consider what it was doing to me? How it might shape my understanding of love and family and belonging?" "Every single day," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "It was the first thing I thought about each morning and the last thing before sleep." But by the time I recognized the full impact, patterns were established, dependencies created. The longer it continued, the harder it became to admit what we were doing. The pain in her expression was genuine, the regret palpable. Not performative, remorse designed to elicit forgiveness, but authentic accountability for harm caused. "I don't know if it helps to hear this now," she continued, "but you were never loved less. You were trusted more, inappropriately, unfairly, in ways that no child should be burdened. We mistook your resilience for invulnerability, your capability for emotional readiness. The greatest disservice wasn't the financial expectation, but our failure to recognize what it cost you beyond dollars and cents." Her acknowledgement, specific, undefended, attentive to emotional impact rather than just financial transactions, offered something my 16-year-old self had desperately needed. Recognition of the invisible wounds beneath the visible payments. "Thank you for telling me," I said softly. "It doesn't change what happened, but it helps me understand." That evening, as my parents finalized packing arrangements for their move, I sat alone on the back porch steps, watching fireflies illuminate the gathering dusk. The journal rested in my lap, a physical artifact of my mother's silent witness to what had transpired in this house so many years ago. My phone chimed with a message from Dylan. "Just heard from Zara. She got the full scholarship to medical school. First in her family to go beyond community college. This is why we do what we do." His text was accompanied by a photo of Zara's acceptance letter, her joy radiating through the screen. Another life redirected, another cycle potentially broken. As I typed back my congratulations, I felt something shift within me. Not a complete resolution of all that had transpired, but a deepening integration of past pain with present purpose. The girl who had once counted out rent money from her grocery store paycheck had become a woman who helped ensure other working teenagers wouldn't face such choices alone. The path hadn't been straightforward. The healing wasn't absolute. The relationships remained works in progress. But sitting there on the steps of the house that had witnessed both inequality and transformation, I recognized that our family's legacy was no longer defined solely by what had been broken, but by what we had chosen to build from those fragments. The Resilience Institute would rise from empty ground, offering tangible support to young people navigating financial challenges similar to those I had faced. My parents would continue their work mentoring others struggling with family financial dynamics. Dylan would use his creative talents to make complex economic concepts accessible to those most affected by financial exclusion, and I would lead these collective efforts while continuing my own journey toward internal liberation from outdated beliefs about conditional worth. None of us could reclaim the years lost to harmful patterns, but together, we had discovered something powerful. When financial wounds are brought into the light with courage and compassion, they can become the foundation not just for personal healing, but for meaningful change that extends far beyond any single family's story. As darkness settled, fully over the neighborhood, I closed my mother's journal and rose from the porch steps. Tomorrow would bring more packing, more planning for the institute, more scholarship applications to review. The work would continue, evolving as we learned and grew. But tonight, in this moment of quiet reflection, I allowed myself to acknowledge how far we had traveled from that courthouse confrontation, not to a perfect destination, but to a place of purpose discovered through pain transformed. And in that ongoing transformation,